Hi, I'm Dr. M. Temple Malt, and I'm a senior lecturer in sociology and criminology. And in today's short lecture, I'm going to be talking to you about researching county lines. In the account by Glover Williams and Finlay 2019, they describe that county lines refers to mobile phone lines used by gangs to move into county towns where they've noticed that there is a profitable drug market. They describe that child criminal exploitation and gangs use children and young people to move drugs and money. So this is kind of a key issue. It's a very contemporary issue, and its focus is on young people, particularly vulnerable people as well, who are disadvantaged in order to kind of move drugs and money around the country. They describe how once a gang has infiltrated a community, they will use various devices such as social media in order to advertise heroin, crack, cocaine, methamphetamine, cannabis, and spice, so like new psychoactive substances. The Home Office came up with the term county lines in 2013, and they recognised that the activity involves using and exploiting children to do criminal activities, and that it involves particularly gangs using children and vulnerable people to move drugs and money. The children's involvement in gangs is a safeguarding issue, so you'll find that this topic, not only is it of importance and cruciality to social work, in kind of health and the NHS, in policing, in policy making, it's also a really, really important subject within criminology and sociology. We also know from various different research that gangs will move up to 80 miles outside of their city of origin in order to make sure that their drug patch is extended, that they can realise there's a profitable market. Another organisation who have been focusing very carefully and monitoring county lines is the National Crime Agency, who have been exploring this issue since 2015. The thing to emphasize when you're trying to research topics such as this, it's really difficult to establish with any certainty prevalence, because obviously this is a nefarious illegal activity and county lines as a practice is hidden. Lines are going to fluctuate based on demand and whether it's perceived that the police are monitoring activities, and what we have access to is estimates. So police forces can report established or emerging county lines problems within their area, but we're never going to actually capture a true picture statistically about this issue. We're reliant on estimations and figures that we have access to and definitions on a particular issue. So in 2015, to give you an idea, 16% of county lines were drug network based. In 2016, so just a year later, 16%, it rose to 83%. And then by 2017, based on the data we have access to, it had risen to 88%, so a slight increase. A particular issue in order to understand county lines is the idea and practice of cuckooing, which I find of particular interest because it kind of concerns the targeting of very vulnerable people for illegal activities. And cuckooing is basically where, like the practice in the animal kingdom, where a bird will push out another kind of bird's eggs in order to kind of raise their own birds, so they don't have to do the work. Gangs will set themselves up in a local property in order to run a business. And what they focus on is targeting local vulnerable adults. These vulnerable adults might have previous history in terms of drug or alcohol dependency. They will target socially isolated women, people with learning difficulties or previous mental health issues, or people who have experienced trauma, so they might have been sexually or domestically abused. And different kinds of promises are made to these vulnerable people. So they're promised drugs, they might pretend or feign friendship, they might pretend to be a boyfriend, they might even use force or coercion in order to gain access to a property in order to run the business, and they pretend these certain kind of friendships, etc. And because a victim might be vulnerable or fit into that vulnerable category or have a very difficult or precarious relationship with people in authority, they don't tend to seek help. And within the nature of gangs, gang members will be assigned different jobs or roles, and that might be based on their gender or their age, and you can work your way up the gang in a kind of hierarchical structure. Now, the Crime Survey for England and Wales and the Office for National Statistics estimate that around 46,000 young people aged 10 to 18 years old are in a gang. What I want to emphasize is this is significant underreporting, because the data they're estimating from does not include vulnerable people who are in residential care, because people who are living in residential care are excluded from completing the survey, yet these groups of people are the most at risk of being recruited. And it's known that residential homes are targeted by county line nominals. It's also very common for gangs to use extreme violence, and young women within these gangs might not actively be at the coalface of perpetrating violence, but they themselves are at risk of being forced into sexual exploitation. Young women and girls, not always, but often times, may not recognise that they're being sexually exploited. They might idolise their partners and kind of get into this very difficult situation where, in order for them to feel protected, to feel loved, to experience financial security, to have social status, things that they haven't known before, they might participate in sex work. They may become compliant, be silent, although what I'm interested in is how this exploitative relationship might start off in a particular way, but over time it might well morph into an abusive relationship. It's quite useful to understand some of the issues that underpin county lines, and it might be, because it involves young people, might be worth kind of understanding what motivates young vulnerable people from getting involved. And often finance or economics is a key issue for vulnerable young people for getting involved, because if their families can't make ends meet and they're under the age of 15 and they can't legitimately get a job, this can be a way of providing income for their family or a way of kind of supporting their family. Another issue to kind of recognise is kind of the labelling around whether someone is a gang member or not, if they're labelled a gang member or not, and it's got legal ramifications. So if someone is labelled as a gang member, it indicates someone has freely chosen to engage in these kind of behaviours, these kind of activities, and this means that they can be liable for criminal charges. If someone kind of can explain that they were exploited, they came to be involved in gang activity through exploitation, it means that they will avoid criminal charges or they might face lesser charges. However, there's not a great deal of kind of social status to say that you were a victim or that you've been exploited, especially if you're a young man, if you sort of say that you've been groomed. Other issues that young people face when they're kind of in these county lines type gang networks is that if they don't have strong supportive friendships, family, close bonds, these gang members will become like family, and kind of they will feel such a strong connection to the gang member that they won't want to kind of leave the gang, or they won't want to let their family down, because the gang has become a family for them. Other reasons why young people are being used in county line activities include that if you're a white young person aged 12 or under, you don't cost a lot, you're quite easy to control, and you certainly raise less suspicion about being involved in nefarious activities amongst police, or you certainly used to. The kinds of activities that young people tend to be involved in means that they might have travel arranged or facilitated for them, so train travel or being part of kind of taxied around, and this kind of means that they end up becoming trafficked. They might be trafficked for sex, or they might be used in order to transport drugs. So drugs might well be packed into condoms or latex gloves or balloons, and that young person will have those drugs stored within their body in order for transportation. Now, transporting drugs in this way, if the condom or latex splits, can be fatal and lead to the carrier's death. Gangs will search for clean skins via social media, and they particularly look for vulnerable young people, so young people who are sleeping rough, young people that show signs of neglect, or that they're living in chaotic circumstances, or that they're in residential homes. Now, once a young person's kind of becomes part of this group, they themselves may be asked to identify other children like themselves as a way of joining the gang and kind of that whole recruitment. Young people themselves are unlikely to approach the police. They might well have had a difficult relationship already with authority. They don't want to kind of break up their family. They don't want to incriminate themselves or experience retribution from other gang members. So these are key issues to be mindful of and thinking about. There's also been other very interesting stuff around school exclusions and kind of school policies, and kind of young people who are in pupil referral units being associated with county lines. So that's another area of interest that you might study or explore. There is a growing body of literature now about county lines and about cuckooing, and Spicer and colleagues, published in 2019, have written about how you study cuckooing. So Jack Spicer describes the first study that they write their paper on, and it's ethnographic fieldwork with anonymised UK police force who had experienced a significant amount of county lines activity between 2017 and 2018. In the write-up of this study, they describe a mixed methods approach that involved 91 days of observing frontline responses to county lines activities across 4 towns, the analysis of police intelligence, and 27 in-depth interviews with police officers and staff and those working for other relevant agencies. In order to get access to this kind of data, the researcher had to be vetted by the police force due to the kinds of sensitivity of that information that he had access to. And given the sensitivity of the data and the fact that it's going to be liable to be used in prosecutions, etc., significant efforts were needed in order to anonymise respondents and people who were giving intelligence, and also kind of protecting officers who were kind of, at the coalface of gathering this data or this information. The second study was undertaken by Liam Moyles, and this research was undertaken in Wiltshire in 2016. And this information, or the ways that they gathered information about cuckooing, was around interviews with drug market actors, people who had worked on behalf of county line dealers, so that was 14 respondents, and those who had regularly purchased drugs from them, so that was 4 people. They also undertook fieldwork in 3 different places in Wiltshire, and access to drug market actors. They had access to these people through local drug services and charitable organisations in Swindon, in Salisbury and Chippenham. So this starts to give you a way into, or how you might research cuckooing and county lines from different perspectives, and then you can start thinking about some of the problems or the pitfalls or some of the biases within the data. And by bringing those 2 data sets together, it allowed them to capture a greater understanding of the realities of county lines and the drug supply model, and combining insights together. So in this paper, Spicer and colleagues describe 3 kinds of cuckooing typologies. So the first one is they refer to as parasitic nest invading, and this is where individuals had not wanted dealers to enter and occupy their homes. The dealers had kind of managed to kind of occupy and run businesses from their home under false pretense, or they'd used force. And the access to homes varied. So one drug runner befriended a retired man with mental health issues in a coffee shop. Another access to home was obtained by taking a sawn-off shotgun, and other runners used that property. Another county line dealer used a female accomplice to pose as a mother in desperate circumstances in order to get access to property. And once a local resident had kind of become lured in and kind of wanted to protect this single mother in desperate circumstances, that enabled her to have access to that person's home. Spicer and colleagues described these as ideal victims. And then we get typology 2, which is referred to as quasi-cuckooing. And this is kind of a willingness or consent to host dealers, which leads to the label of quasi-cuckooing. So it's not the kind of pure cuckooing as such. So this is kind of where initially someone with a flat or a house will kind of allow a dealer to kind of use their home as kind of a business. They'll let them kind of, they let you stay overnight in order that you supply them with drugs, or you kind of help to pay their rent, or you kind of supply their drug habit. And so initially this arrangement starts out as reciprocal, so you kind of get something out of it. And it means that you don't have to get yourself involved in petty crime in order to feed your drug habit. You have access, ready supply of drugs. However, eventually this kind of relationship is no longer reciprocal. You end up in a situation where it's very difficult to get rid of the person in your home. One person describes having to move out of their home and started rough sleeping. Others become trapped in their home, and dealers start to restrict who they're allowed to speak to. They're not allowed to speak to friends. They're kind of not allowed to kind of access welfare services. Or some drug dealers will start to charge the person whose home they're using. They start to charge them for drugs, and then kind of like put them into debt bondage in order to kind of like make them become runners. So they have to kind of become drug runners in order to kind of feed their drug habit, and to kind of allow them to use the property. It kind of becomes very messy. And then kind of becoming aware that law enforcement were monitoring your home and the fact that they might be liable for their criminal behaviour, for letting kind of their flat or house be used for criminal activities, is what eventually causes them to seek help. Now, the third typology of cuckooing that the Spicer and colleagues describe in their 2019 paper is this idea of coupling. And this is where access to a home or a flat is through a male county line dealer who will enter into a sexual activity or a sexual relationship with a female resident. And this is maybe where a young runner will have a sexual encounter with a local heroin or crack user, or someone who is alcohol dependent or has mental health issues. And it'll start off kind of fairly innocuous. They go back to her flat for a drink and a party, and then they might pretend and strike up a sexual relationship, and then kind of like this kind of leads to compliancy. And kind of what they describe is that dealers are able to recognize if a young woman has a certain vulnerability, or a history of abuse, or perhaps kind of they'd experienced grooming or sexual exploitation early on in life, and this kind of meant that they are kind of vulnerable to kind of being exploited in this particular way. Another fascinating study that I want to talk to you about researching county lines and gang activity is the Keir Irwin Rogers paper of 2018. It's a fascinating study. Now, what he did was to analyse social media posts over 6 months using 5 different platforms. These include Instagram, Periscope, Snapchat, Twitter and YouTube. And he only accessed public or semi-public accounts. And young people's norms around online privacy mean that there's a lot of content that's uploaded to public and semi-public accounts, which meant he was able to access them. What he did was to remove anything that could lead to these young people being identified, and we'll see shortly, got somebody to draw the screenshots and use pseudonyms instead in order to preserve anonymity. So he did a variety of different studies, and this paper draws on these different studies. So in project 1, it involved focus groups and interviews between 2014 and 2016, and this was an exploration of young people's education who had been excluded from mainstream schools, and this took place in 5 alternative provisions across 3 major cities in the UK. He did focus groups and interviews with 25 members of staff, 20 pupils that were accessing these alternative provisions, and 50 hours of observations. This is kind of where you hang about, you have access to these young groups, they trust you, you can observe interactions. His second project involved exploring young people's use of social media and serious youth violence, and this involved focus groups and interviews with 20 professionals that included youth workers, perspectives from probation officers, police officers and specialist voluntary sector workers, and 18 young people who were living in 2 UK cities. What he describes is when he set out to do these studies, he didn't anticipate that these projects would bring about data that would talk about young people's involvement in drug distribution. And he said that these 2 projects meant that it was a common and recurring theme because of the links between illicit drug markets, exclusion from school, and violence between young people. Absolutely fascinating. So he describes that new technologies are being used to perpetrate criminal activities and communicate criminal activities to others is a new type of trend in criminology. And he says for a long time people have been photographing or making videos of themselves and uploading images of their everyday activities online. But he also says that people are also recording and uploading their criminal activities online. He says that smartphone devices are allowing young people to follow the lives of super rich, and 96% of 16 to 24-year-olds have a smartphone device in the UK. He says that when we display what we buy in our possessions can make some people living in poverty feel inadequate. And this is not something new. This has been written about for years. But the technologies that we use now to kind of advertise our consumption is new. And he says that when people are involved in drug distribution, it's not always about money. In focus group interviews with young people and analysing people's posts that they put on social media, money is key to why young people get involved in drug distribution. In image 1, it depicts a young person holding a stack of £20 notes to his ear, symbolising a mobile phone. Another screenshot shows a young person getting out of a luxury car with a caption implying that lucrative profits are more than adequate compensation for the potential fatal risks that accompany one's participation in the illicit drug trade. Other screenshots provide further examples of young people displaying openly the amount of money they get through dealing drugs. Top middle young person with banknotes spread over his lap. Top right bundle of £20 banknotes, good evening so far. The bottom right young man holding a bundle of banknotes accompanied by the caption gang gang. In interviews with youth workers, some young people will get involved in drug distribution in order to buy expensive items like trainers or clothes, and these are high-end material items are much quicker to get when people are involved in drug distribution rather than doing a minimum wage job. These goods are easy to get hold of in a short space of time. So, for example, some young people can say that they can earn £1,000 in one day. Earning £1,000 when you're in a minimum wage job might take a good few months, if not a year. The other images show what the money has been used to buy. Irwin Rogers claims that young people's involvement in drug distribution is not new, but social media has raised young people's awareness of the rewards on offer from drug distribution, and it can elevate people's social recognition and status. He says that because young people don't have access to opportunities in the workplace that give them respect and reasonable remuneration, is why some young people will find drug distribution attractive, and it's a way of getting fast money. His analysis of social media posts reveal an example of a young man who tried to give up his life as a drug runner by working part-time in a supermarket. He was spotted by a rival gang who took a photograph of him working in the supermarket and videoed him stacking supermarket shelves in his work attire. And then they uploaded these videos to social media, and the purpose was to ridicule and humiliate him by contrasting recent photos which boasted how he used to live as a lucrative gangster lifestyle against his position as a low-paid supermarket employee. Unfortunately, within a matter of weeks, the young person quit their job and was back running drugs in his local area. Irwin Rogers explains during focus group interviews with young people that they tend to be resistant to certain kinds of low paid work. So, for example, getting up at 5 a.m. to do a job for £6 an hour when they could go on the road and get £1,000 in their pocket and come back with new Krebs trainers and a new tracksuit. He says that young men are at particular risk, and there are certain young men who might find this risk attractive and alluring. Being involved in distributing drugs is hypermasculine, and it's also a very risky activity. But being involved demonstrates that young people have street capital, and having this street capital is important for kudos among their peers and keeps the stigma and judgment that they perceive coming from society at a distance. When he interviews young people that were excluded from high school or mainstream school, when you're excluded from school, excluded from GCSEs and qualifications, it massively reduces your options for getting access to mobility and decent jobs. Getting into drugs distribution then is not just about buying brands, it's also about looking after the family. And some young men who were interviewed by Irwin Rogers are seen and see themselves as the head of the household and being looked to provide and resort to drugs distribution as a way of providing for their family. There's also music videos uploaded to YouTube and lyrics of young men. There's a tendency in politics to view young people's involvement in drugs and distribution as adults exploiting children using threats of physical violence. So, for example, the Rochdale grooming scandal, and that young girls are at risk of predatory adults. Irwin Rogers is keen to point out that politicians seek to blame the young violent and coercive gang leader and blame the individual. And what he says this does is to downplay the importance of underlying structural factors that facilitate and drive activity in illicit drug markets at all levels. He says it's naive to think that young people will turn their backs on drug distribution if only we can prevent gang leaders from trapping their unwilling victims through processes of violence, intimidation and coercion. He says that structural factors will create the space for adults to attract young people to engage in drug distribution, often without the need to resort to intimidation and violence. He says that focus groups and social media platform analysis indicate that young people are enticed into involvement in drug distribution because of its association with fast money and material rewards. Those occupying more senior positions in drug distribution hierarchy often make efforts to glamorize their own lifestyles, portraying idealized images to young people that imply drug running is glamorous and lucrative activity, providing they're prepared to work hard. I've really enjoyed doing this short lecture about researching county lines. Here is a set of readings in case you kind of wanted to read more about county lines and about gang culture and topics. It's also worth pointing out that in addition to reading, there are loads and loads of TV series that talk about county lines and about young people involved in these kinds of activities, like Three Girls, the Save Me series that's on Sky Atlantic, and Line of Duty have focused on the kind of involvement between corrupt cops and county lines activities. And I'm sure there's loads more drama too that you could watch and kind of draw inspiration from in order to research this topic.